This is the American Veterans Disabled for Life Memorial in Washington, D.C. It was a long, hard dream to fulfill, but now it's a reality. Dedicated in 2014, this memorial honors the sacrifice of the millions of men and women who were wounded or injured while serving in defense of our country. I'm Captain Dale Dye, and I'm one of them. Imagine what it's like to live without an arm or a leg or your eyesight or your peace of mind. It's a tremendous sacrifice to make, one deserving of our deepest respect and thanks. But these brave Americans are often forgotten when the guns have gone silent. For them, the battle never ends. And for the last century, one organization has been their voice, the Disabled American Veterans. Since World War I, DAV has fought to protect the rights and improve the lives of those who pay the price of freedom every day. This is the story of America's disabled veterans. This memorial's proximity to the United States Capitol building is a critical part of its design and intent. Only 1,400 feet away, decisions are made about war and peace that directly affect the lives of America's citizens and the servicemen and women who protect them. In 1917, millions of young Americans were called upon to make the world safe for democracy. World War I was called the war to end all wars, but it was really the beginning of modern mechanized warfare. In 1917, all of America's military power was called on to participate. More than 100,000 Americans lost their lives, and 200,000 more were wounded or otherwise disabled. The high numbers reflected the lethality of modern artillery and the introduction of machine guns and poison gas. Across the nation, Americans saw the grim cost of the fighting in Europe. Veterans returned without arms and legs. They were blind, deaf, or mentally injured. Chemical warfare left men with seared lungs, gasping for each breath. Shell shock, a debilitating mental state accompanied by tremors, nightmares, and constant anxiety, affected as many as 1 in 4 veterans, and no one knew the cause. 3 different government agencies were charged with the care of the war wounded, and bureaucratic nightmares were added to the veterans' injuries. There simply weren't enough hospitals to provide treatment. Some were lucky to get cots in the hallways. Others had to fend for themselves. The government had sent a generation off to fight a war, but failed to foresee that many would come home wounded and sick. Meager government attempts were made to provide job training for those missing an arm or a leg or their eyesight. Certain jobs were considered appropriate. Blind veterans caned chairs and tuned pianos. An adaptive chair made it possible for those without legs to get assembly line jobs. But with the onset of a post-war recession, there were no jobs to be had. Disabled veterans begging on street corners became a familiar sight, and that needed to change. On Christmas Day 1919, Judge Robert S. Marks of Cincinnati, Ohio, sponsored a dinner for a group of disabled American veterans receiving special job training at a local trade academy. Marks understood their situation because he was one of them. During an attack in the Meuse-Argonne offensive, a high-explosive shell landed close by, killing those around him and wounding Marks in 14 places. The very next day, the war came to an end. Marks knew firsthand the extreme hardships disabled veterans faced.
A man could not go through that conflict and come back and take his place as a normal human being. Robert S. Marks.
And it was during this Christmas dinner that the idea of a national organization of, by, and for disabled veterans was born. They called it the Disabled American Veterans of the World War. And Marks was elected its first national commander.
In war, all are eligible to be wounded, so all the sick and wounded would be eligible to join.
The new organization soon had 25,000 members across the country. They worked to raise public awareness about disabled veterans and for government programs to address the long-term needs of the injured. In 1922, it was boosted by an auxiliary, which allowed family members to add their voice to the cause. To raise the necessary funding, Marks went to the public. He chose a flower, the forget-me-not, as a reminder of those who fought and became disabled in the Great War. A nationwide Forget-Me-Not Day was held on Armistice Day, November 11th, and sales of this small memento sustained the organization for many years to come. To help disabled veterans attend their second national convention, industrialist Henry Ford organized a caravan of 50 Ford Model Ts to take them to San Francisco. Even film star Rudolph Valentino made an appearance to support their cause. And the efforts of this band of disabled veterans quickly paid off. In 1921, the U.S. government established the United States Veterans Bureau, a precursor to today's U.S. Department of Veterans Affairs, at the urging of the disabled veterans of the World War. Now the care of all veterans was centralized into one federal agency. A system of veterans' hospitals was established that provided long-term care, especially for war-related wounds and illnesses, sickness from poison gas, and mental conditions caused by shell shock. The large number of severely disfigured patients led to advances in surgery that allowed portions of the body to be reconstructed through a long and painful series of bone and skin grafts. Some were fitted with prosthetic masks to hide their wounds, but life would never be normal for them again. A law in Chicago prohibited these disfigured men from walking in public areas because they might frighten women and children. And then the economy collapsed. With the onset of the Great Depression, there were widespread calls to curtail government expenditures, and veterans' benefits were high on the list. At the height of the crisis in 1932, thousands of economically desperate World War I veterans, many of them disabled, marched on Washington, D.C., seeking an early payment of a bonus promised to them for their service overseas. Instead, they were violently routed from the capital by the U.S. military, led by the same commanders they had served under in World War I. The conscience of the nation was shocked by this shameful treatment of veterans. If the Great Depression taught disabled veterans anything, it was that their benefits were always on the line, and they needed a strong voice in government to protect them. To this end, the Disabled American Veterans of the World War received a federal charter from Congress in 1932, which strengthened the organization's influence in the halls of power. At the same time in Europe, the wings of war were stirring again. A new generation of Americans would soon be called on to serve, and many would return home wounded. Each of you bears upon his body the permanent, honorable scars of dangerous service. Service rendered in order that our great nation might continue to live according to the expressed will of its own citizens. In 1946, General Dwight David Eisenhower said these words, engraved here at the north end of the memorial's wall of gratitude. He was talking about the greatest generation and the price they paid to save the world from tyranny.
The Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor
would place millions of American service members in harm's way in nearly every part of the globe. With the world at war again, the Disabled American Veterans of the World War shortened its name. It became Disabled American Veterans, or DAV. But its goal remained the same: make the government prepared for the men and women who came home changed by wartime service. At the height of the war, with the support of DAV and other veterans groups, Congress passed the GI Bill of Rights. This important piece of legislation provided a wide range of benefits to all veterans. It established new hospitals, low-interest mortgages, money for college or trade school tuition, and disability compensation based on the severity of the injury. By September 2, 1945, when the Japanese signed the Instrument of Surrender on the USS Missouri, 16.3 million Americans had served in World War II. 671,000 men and women came home wounded, over 3 times more than after World War I. 300,000 Americans were wounded seriously enough to require long-term hospitalization and rehabilitation, and DAV representatives were at their bedsides assisting and recruiting them. Some of these new DAV members went on to become prominent national leaders and strong advocates for veterans.
It was April 14, 1945. Went out to rescue a radio man. I was dragging him back, and suddenly I felt this sting in my back of my right shoulder. My arms, I couldn't raise it, couldn't move them. Turned out later I had a broken neck. Put a big M on my forehead in my own blood to show that I had morphine, so they didn't come along and give me too much morphine. You know, it takes a lot out of a person. I don't have good feeling in my left hand. I don't use my right hand. Jimmy, I'm lucky. I'm here. These poor guys that never got home. Look, that could have been doctors, lawyers. Well, I'm very proud to be a member of DAV, and I worked for years as a DAV service officer trying to help veterans with their claims. Senator Inouye, Dan Inouye, was injured a week apart, a hill apart in Italy.
We started the attack early in the morning, and going up there at about 9 o'clock in the morning, I got my first injury. I was shot through the stomach. And then I got hit in the leg. In the final encounter, I was shot in the arm at my elbow. And it was obvious that my arm was gone because it was just hanging. I told the fellas, let's keep on going. We wiped out all 3 machine gun nests and took over the hill. 1 casualty, me. I became a member of the Disabled American Veterans in 1948. The DAV was the only veterans organization that was open to all. The only requirement was that you were wounded in service.
Following the Second World War, DAV grew into one of the country's largest charitable institutions. More than 300 newly disabled veterans were hired by DAV and trained as national service officers. They provided free advice and benefit assistance to their comrades. DAV's support of advances in prosthesis and rehabilitative medicine reflected a growing belief in the complete social reintegration of even the most severely disabled veterans. As with World War I, new medical advances created for veterans benefited the entire public. U.S. Army training films featured handless veterans telling their stories, which focused on the extent to which prosthesis geared to function rather than to aesthetics enabled an amputee to do just about anything. With encouragement from DAV, a League of Disabled Veterans baseball teams came into being, the National AMPS. 2 AMPS teams played exhibition games across the country, amazing audiences with their physical capabilities. DAV's influence continued to expand when, in 1948, General Jonathan M. Wainwright was elected its national commander. Famous for his defense of Corregidor in World War II and his 39 months as a prisoner of war, Wainwright traveled the country, speaking on behalf of disabled veterans and the nation's responsibility to them. That responsibility was about to grow again. One edge of this memorial is defined by a unique work of sculptural art. Disabled veterans' words and those of loved ones and caregivers are etched and embedded in the luminous surface of multi-layered glass panels. These are their voices. It's not what you've lost that counts. It's what you do with what's left. Interspersed between the etched quotes are powerful photographic images embedded in glass that are evocative of the disabled veteran's experience. And that experience was a living hell during the war in Korea. In 1950, war broke out in a country most Americans had never heard of before. During the Korean War, 36,000 Americans lost their lives, and another 103,000 came home wounded. Women had always played a role in the U.S. military, but rarely had they served in greater numbers closer to the front than in Korea. U.S. Army nurses played a critical part in mobile Army surgical hospitals, or MASH units. They managed overwhelming numbers of patients. Some nurses were injured, some were killed, and many would never forget the horrors of the war they experienced.
I got into the war because they called for volunteers, and many of us nurses volunteered, went to basic training, and went to Korea. I was assigned to the operating room there. If you made it to the MASH, your chance of dying was 1 in 1,000. The helicopters would start bringing patients, and it was just one huge trauma room there. That's all it was, and it was all mostly young boys. There was one soldier who we amputated both legs, and he was a football player, and that's the one thing I remember, talking to that soldier.
Just prior to being inducted into the service, I was playing professional baseball with the St. Louis Cardinal chain. I was drafted into the Army, and the Korean War was on, and I eventually ended up in Korea. We had a break in the communications, and we went up to maintain those lines and to fix the break. And somewhere along the line, I tripped a landmine. I looked and saw my right leg laying out in the field in front of me, and I lifted my right hand to do something. And as I did, I saw my little finger on my right hand hanging down about 6 to 8 inches. They immediately dispatched a helicopter. When we landed and they opened a bubble, all I asked was, "Am I going to live?" And nobody answered me. I later found out that I was on an artificial kidney, and that artificial kidney was the only thing that kept me alive. I came to, and the doctor was there, and the doctor said to me, "You're going to live now." From there on in, I was on Easy Street. I was able, through the government, to get a new car. I was able to obtain employment. I became a useful citizen, and is one of the reasons why I became so active in the disabled American veterans to help my fellow veteran. I lost both of my legs, most of my left hip and buttocks, most of the right side of my right leg is severely scarred. My arm is wounded from the elbow up to the shoulder, and my finger is gone, and my index finger is very badly disfigured. Other than that, I'm in great health.
Because of these MASH units and their proximity to the battlefronts, many lives were saved that might have perished in World War I and II. But this life-saving advance increased the number of veterans with severe disabilities that would require lifelong support and assistance. With nearly 4.7 million disabled veterans now living in the United States, attitudes about disability were starting to change, and disabled veterans needed to earn a living just like everyone else. That was the premise of Major General Melvin J. Moss when he became DAV National Commander in 1955. Moss was known as the Blind General. He made finding good jobs for disabled veterans a top priority and launched the slogan, "It's good business to hire the handicapped." The campaign was an immediate success.
There's a reason why the physically handicapped ask no favors, but try a little harder, have a little more to give. It's what they fought for in 2 world wars.
The disability rights movement gained more momentum when a prominent DAV life member became President of the United States. John F. Kennedy was severely injured in the Pacific theater of World War II when his PT boat was rammed by a Japanese destroyer. As a result, he suffered constant and severe back pain. Kennedy's Committee on the Employment of the Handicapped made government hiring of handicapped people a priority. "It is fitting," said Kennedy, "that the government, as an employer, should lead the way in selective placement of handicapped persons so as to utilize their skills and abilities." This program benefited all Americans with disabilities. Meanwhile, the United States' involvement in Southeast Asia was steadily growing, but the American public hardly noticed. The design of the American Veterans Disabled for Life Memorial includes as its central component this star-shaped fountain with a self-sustaining fire emerging from its center. It symbolizes the fire of conflict and is a reminder of the hope that springs from endurance. That endurance was severely tested during America's war in Vietnam. Nearly 9 million military personnel served during the Vietnam War era. 1 million fought in combat or provided close combat support. More than 58,000 Americans died. More than 300,000 were wounded in action or injured. The severely disabled numbered 75,000, and more than 20,000 were classified 100% disabled. Initially, benefits for Vietnam veterans, even those disabled, were not equal to those of veterans of World War II. With DAV Advocacy, the injustice was soon remedied. President Lyndon B. Johnson signed the Veterans Readjustment Benefits Act of 1966. As the Vietnam War progressed, DAV renewed its National Service Officer Training Program. It brought newly disabled Vietnam veterans on board, training them to become experts in the field of veterans' claims. The signature injury of the Vietnam War was the devastating loss of multiple limbs, the result of booby traps and landmines hidden in jungles by an elusive enemy. In spite of such horrific injuries, many of these multiple amputees have lived long and rewarding lives.
I joined the service back in 1966. I got drafted right out of high school. We were going through the jungles, and all of a sudden we heard explosions. And that's when I got hit. I remember being inside gun hospital. I raised the sheets up and looked. This is when it dawned to me that I had no legs, that I had lost them. And this feeling of, what am I gonna do? It just scared me. DAV was the one that told me exactly what they could do for me. When I got out, they put in the application, sent it in, and I got my disability. DAV helped me get my home, get my automobile, and they also helped me with my medical. They assist me with prosthetics. If it wasn't for DAV, I wouldn't have had anything.
After the Vietnam War, DAV experienced another dramatic increase in membership. In 1974, a caravan of 6 new motorhomes, converted to serve as rolling offices, pulled out of DAV headquarters to extend services to the suburbs and rural areas of America. But as in the past, America had not fully prepared to pay for the long-term costs of war. A harsh Life magazine expose on several VA hospitals pictured a system stretched to the breaking point. Protests by DAV and other veterans groups provoked a large public outcry, which led the government to make widespread improvements in VA medical programs. These changes included innovations in plastic surgery, prosthetics and assistive devices such as folding and motorized wheelchairs, hand-controlled automobiles, and adapted environments. The advances allowed even the most severely disabled veterans to function in society.
I got injured. The track we were riding on hit a 500-pound bomb that was rigged as a landmine and got burned over 41% of my body. Lost my right hand at the wrist and my left arm at the shoulder, and a lot of disfiguring scars from the burns. I didn't see a future worth living at that point.
Family support, this is Bobby, may I help you?
But I had to make the adjustment to living life as a double amputee. Someone was there to serve me, someone was there to say, hey, you can do it. Finding out the disability, the compensation, educational benefits, the housing allowances. I never knew that I could get my automobile modified. Those are the kinds of things that DAV does for the veteran.
As time passed, a new, invisible cost of the war began to appear. Agent Orange, a powerful herbicide dropped from the air to clear jungle undergrowth, was widely used in Vietnam. There were signs that it caused cancer, respiratory disease, and other serious health effects. But the government would not acknowledge its adverse effects on Vietnam veterans without hard scientific evidence. Large numbers of Vietnam veterans were also struggling to reintegrate back into society. They were plagued with nightmares and nervous disorders, often living alone and isolated, just like the victims of shell shock and combat fatigue in previous wars. In 1976, DAV funded the seminal Forgotten Warrior Project, which first defined the issue of post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD, among war veterans. As many as 30% of Vietnam veterans experienced its symptoms. The project spurred groundbreaking research that led the federal government to recognize the psychological impact of war on veterans of Vietnam and all wars.
When you're a medic, you experience a lot of trauma. And it was a very painful experience for me. And for my generation, PTSD did not exist as a diagnosis. And over time, it became an issue in my life. I became homeless. I ended up broke and was trying to figure out what was going on in my life. And while this deep depression, anxiety, frustration, this hypervigilance, this anger, DAV really helped me complete my journey. And if there's any resource that they are aware of, they make that available to you. So their help, it allowed me to get a key to a door that belonged to me in a safe and comfortable community.
When Congress finally enacted legislation to comprehensively deal with PTSD, DAV's Vietnam Veterans Outreach Program was already there to serve as an effective treatment model. It's known today as the Vet Center Program.
I served in the U.S. Marine Corps 1966 to 68, and I served in Vietnam. I was still having nightmares and flashbacks. I read in the paper about a new place that just opened in town called the Vet Center. And I couldn't believe it. There was 20 guys, all with the same problem. When I come out of the group, I said, I feel a hell of a lot better than I felt when I went into the group.
Vietnam had another legacy, and that was one of strong public opposition to the war. Disabled veterans suffered not only from their wounds, but also from an ungrateful public when they returned home.
The 1980s were a time of relative peace for U.S. military forces. But the wars never ended for the large population of disabled veterans in the United States. As time passed, the public and politicians began to forget their continuing sacrifice. But DAV made sure they weren't left behind. In response to government cuts to veterans' travel benefits, DAV created a national network of volunteer drivers administered by DAV at VA facilities nationwide. Since DAV's transportation network began in 1987, thousands of volunteer drivers have logged millions of miles, taking veterans to and from their VA medical appointments, all at no charge.
So what branch of the service were you in, Vince?
I was in the 45th Infantry, Oklahoma National Guard outfit. So them jumpers, they just start shooting right down them rocks, and them sparks are flying all over the place. And all of a sudden, darn, took a bullet. I weighed about 185 pounds by the time I got captured, and I weighed 102 when I was liberated. I think it's just a wonderful idea that they upgraded all this transportation for everybody.
All right, Vince, here we are.
All righty. And I thank you.
It sure was nice to get to know you.
Okay, and I appreciate you guys doing what you're doing.
To complement the transportation network, DAV continues its relationship with Ford Motor Company. To date, Ford has donated 223 vehicles to DAV for the transportation program. And DAV has donated more than $80 million worth of vehicles to help ensure veterans have access to health care. Early on, DAV also saw the potential of sports therapy for critically disabled veterans. Beginning in 1987, and every year since, DAV has presented the National Disabled Veterans Winter Sports Clinic along with the Department of Veterans Affairs. This remarkable event promotes rehabilitation through adaptive alpine and Nordic skiing, rock climbing, sled hockey, scuba diving, and other adaptive sports and activities. It gives severely injured veterans an opportunity to test their limits, boost their self-confidence and esteem, and feel a spirit of comradeship with other disabled veterans. It's known as the Miracle on a Mountainside for a reason.
My name's Feet Jensen. That's F-E-E-T, because I don't have any. This is my first year here at the Winter Sports Clinic. It is hard. It's hard on my body. It's so difficult to do, and that's what drives me. I've learned so much about me and that I can do it, and that I don't need everybody's help. I don't need anybody's help. It's on me. It's on me to make sure that I am good. I am amazingly impressed with DAV and how they've helped so many people come together into one location. And I see where their positivity can actually have a really big impact on people's lives.
My name's Jatea Taylor. I'm a Marine Corps veteran and above-knee amputee. I got injured during a training accident. So when I originally found out that I wasn't going to be physically active how I used to be, it took a big toll on my mental health. Depression set in, anxiety, and it just became a world that I really didn't want to live in until I found adaptive sports, and that kind of gave me motivation, said I could still be who I was, I just had to do it differently. So originally I was a sit skier, so being able to switch over to snowboarding was just spectacular. An event like this is liberating for veterans. We know we're going to be in safe hands. You understand what we go through. Beautiful turn. Winter Sports Clinic brings out a whole different kind of personality in people. We're not necessarily disabled, we're just differently able. Adaptive sports saved my life.
Some of the most important work DAV does on behalf of disabled veterans is in that building behind me, the U.S. Capitol. The policies our government creates have a real and profound effect on the everyday lives of those injured or wounded while serving in the military. Since its very beginning, DAV has been responsible for most of the major legislation that makes life better for disabled veterans.
In the 1980s, Congress created the United States Court of Veterans' Appeals, which allowed veterans to dispute VA benefit claim decisions with free DAV legal representation. DAV was a primary participant and had a hand in creating some of the court's most far-reaching decisions, and many veterans needed it. For decades, veterans stationed at nuclear test sites experienced much higher levels of cancer than the general population.
Awe-inspiring in its significance for man.
Oh, you're all right.
But their illness was not considered a presumptive disease and did not qualify the veterans for disability benefits. DAV was one of the first veterans service organizations to recognize these radiation-related health problems and pressed lawmakers to provide compensation and full VA benefits for the atomic veterans. The effort paid off with the Radiation-Exposed Veterans Compensation Act, signed into law in 1988. Congress passed another decades-long DAV initiative in 1991, the Agent Orange Act, entitled veterans who served in Southeast Asia to receive VA compensation benefits for presumed exposure to the herbicide. It was a great victory for thousands of Vietnam veterans who had suffered for years from debilitating diseases without compensation.
They would bring it aboard on their clothes, and then it would get transferred onto us. Everything that I get here is free for me because I have a 70% disability.
The period of peace for the United States came to an abrupt halt in 1990 when Iraqi forces invaded the neighboring country of Kuwait. In response, U.S. and coalition forces launched Operation Desert Storm, designed to drive out the Iraqis. The weapons of war had changed, and so had the dangers to U.S. forces.
New precision-guided missiles ushered in the era of high-tech warfare. Embedded reporters brought the battle home in real time on national television. When ground operations began, it took only 100 hours for coalition forces to force Iraqi troops out of Kuwait. But when the Gulf War veterans returned home, many began to experience a wide range of unexplained symptoms such as fatigue, dizziness, joint pain, and breathing problems. Dozens of studies were conducted, and researchers ultimately decided that the illnesses were most likely caused by exposure to chemical and biological weapons. This included an anti-nerve gas drug given to U.S. troops during the Gulf War. DAV had long protested the use of experimental drugs on military personnel without their permission and helped draft the Veterans Persian Gulf War Benefits Act. Passed in 1994, the Act authorized the Veterans Administration to establish a presumption of service connection for illnesses associated with the Gulf War, just as it had for the victims of Agent Orange and atomic testing.
For years, the government did not listen. With steps taken since 1993 and the important step we are taking today, we are showing that America can listen and act.
Another major advance for disabled veterans came when President Bill Clinton appointed then DAV Executive Director Jesse Brown to become Secretary of Veterans Affairs. Severely wounded in Vietnam, Brown brought a degree of understanding and compassion to his stewardship that had been absent for years.
Our old rules about compensation must change. Our solution must fit their problems. Their problems cannot be made to fit our solutions.
As the 20th century drew to an end, a new problem appeared. Surveys revealed that more than 250,000 veterans were homeless and surviving on the streets. Men and women who had served the nation honorably, many with physical and mental disabilities, were sleeping under bridges and in cardboard shelters. DAV took the lead in combating this national epidemic with a Homeless Veterans Initiative. DAV chapters and departments across the country began to sponsor stand-downs for homeless veterans, providing them with nutritious meals, warm clothing, and medical and dental services.
I was homeless. I lived outside rough for 7 years. I'd kind of give up. There was a little hope. The DAV and Homeless Initiative program people visited me. We built a rapport. I started feeling like there is caring people and still here in America. I finally decided to take a chance. I'm glad I did. I've got a full-time job right now. I'm going to have my own apartment. I'll be back to my normal life.
I'm Miss America 2000, Heather French.
Miss America 2000 was featured in a public service campaign to call attention to this national disgrace.
Many of these homeless are women with children. With understanding and help, homeless veterans can turn their lives around. Please join me and help our homeless veterans.
The Veterans Administration responded with new initiatives and increased resources to help homeless veterans. But with more and more veterans to care for at the end of the 20th century, the VA was forced to make patients wait longer and longer for medical appointments. Some had to wait months, seriously endangering the health of many thousands of veterans and creating a national emergency.
Some of America's military veterans, men and women, we all owe a tremendous debt to, are dying. They're dying needlessly because of long waits and delayed care at some U.S. veterans' hospitals.
Again, DAV Advocacy led the way, this time to the enactment of the Veterans Millennium Health Care and Benefits Act of 1999. This act required the VA to provide more home and community-based medical options to provide timely care to veterans. It came just in time for a new threat to America.
The memorial has a large reflecting pool that extends all the way down to the etched glass sculptural elements and ties the whole site in with the star pool. It's a contemplative place, a place to think about the sacrifices made by millions of American men and women to preserve and protect our country. And those sacrifices continued after the attack on America of September 11th, 2001.
Not since Pearl Harbor 60 years before had America experienced such an attack on our soil with such horrific loss of life. In the weeks, months, and years that followed, millions of young Americans volunteered to fight in Iraq and Afghanistan. Thousands lost their lives. And tens of thousands suffered catastrophic injuries in fierce combat, ambushes, roadside bombings, and uprisings. The wards at Walter Reed Army Medical Center and the National Naval Medical Center at Bethesda near Washington, D.C. were flooded with the wounded. These young Americans had the same fears and concerns as veterans of past conflicts. DAV members who survived similar injuries received special permission to be at their bedsides, helping them file benefits claims and assuring them that life was worth continuing. To find better treatments for these injuries, DAV urged Congress to create a network of state-of-the-art polytrauma centers within the Veterans Administration. Today, the groundbreaking work performed in 5 different centers across the country will benefit not only veterans, but society at large. DAV also contributed heavily to the Center for the Intrepid in San Antonio. Opened in 2007, the center is equipped with state-of-the-art technology and techniques to rehabilitate the most severely wounded veterans recovering from amputations, burns, and other serious injuries. Since the center opened, DAV has helped fund the creation of 8 additional Intrepid Spirit Centers across the country. A signature wound of the Iraq and Afghanistan wars is traumatic brain injury, or TBI, the result of explosions and violent impact to the head. Nearly 100,000 veterans suffered its consequences. Remarkable advances in skull and brain surgery helped most of these veterans to survive.
We got within 10 miles of Fallujah, and as we were rolling along on the highway, we seemed to have rolled right over top an IED.
Whoa!
And when it blasted, I went with the blast, and so did my arm.
But when Todd was first injured and he had to have brain surgery, he was in a coma for a couple months, and it was very unlikely that he was going to ever function on any kind of higher level.
It has taken my brain and my body significant time to rehabilitate.
Only in recent years has medical science begun to understand how TBIs affect the mental process of the brain. Sophisticated technology has provided some answers on how to reverse the condition. But for many veterans, the effects will continue for years, and so will their need for care.
There you go, way back.
With the new millennium, there came a new generation of leaders at DAV. The armed services were changing, and so were the needs of its veterans. In Iraq and Afghanistan, large open-air pits were used to burn military waste and exposed military personnel to toxic fumes.
That is what we live next to.
DAV brought the hazards of burn pits to light. And in 2010, lawmakers banned the military from using burn pits except where there was no feasible alternative. In 2019, DAV helped draft legislation that, if passed, would make it easier for veterans to receive health care and benefits for illnesses and diseases caused by exposure to toxins from burn pits.
And right now in the U.S., there are nearly 240,000 unemployed Iraqi and Afghanistan vets.
Employment is a constant concern for disabled veterans. In 2014, DAV established a national employment department to help ensure veterans and their families get the tools, resources, and opportunities they need to competitively enter the job market and secure meaningful employment.
We were on a patrol in Iraq and we came across a pressure plate IED and it took out the front part of the vehicle of the convoy that we were in. Luckily everybody survived. I was able to have some surgeries on my knees and now I can walk downstairs without too much pain. I knew there was going to be a DAV job fair. I knew I was transitioning out and I knew I wanted to have a great job. So I went to that job fair. It gave me the opportunity to interview with these companies and land a job in the utilities industry.
The initiative grew from 65 events in its first year to 145 in-person and virtual job fairs in 2019. During that time, attendees received more than 130,000 job offers.
DAV is also working to help transitioning military members on military installations all over the country to help service members transition to civilian life.
The role of women in the military has evolved over the years. Today, women are a critical part of America's active force. They fly combat aircraft, are assigned to missile placements, protect convoys in hostile territory, and serve on ships around the world. And many get seriously hurt. Following in the footsteps of her father, now U.S. Senator Tammy Duckworth became a commissioned officer in the U.S. Army Reserve and chose to fly helicopters because it was one of the few combat jobs open to women.
I was actually their commander of a Black Hawk unit, the Black Hawk unit in Chicago, up until just a few months before we were deployed. We were flying all over Baghdad, all over central and southern Iraq, and we're headed back north. I heard tap, tap, tap on the side of the aircraft, metal on metal, and then there was this giant fireball. The rocket-propelled grenade that hit us hit right outside my door and had taken off, basically atomized my right leg. My left leg was apparently hanging by some skin, but I never looked down, and my arm was almost severed as well. I fully woke up about 10 days after the shoot down. And I think one of the first things I said to my husband was, you know, can you get me some pain medicine? My legs are on fire. And that's when he had to go grab the doc to tell me that my legs were gone. And so it was a real long process of just regaining strength and just learning to do everything all over again. DAV actually represents my interests in dealing with the federal VA and my claims, and I've been very pleased with how I've been taken care of by DAV.
In every war and every generation, American women have served the cause of freedom.
Women are eligible for the same benefits as all veterans, in spirit, but not always in practice.
In 2008, DAV's Stand Up for Women Veterans Advocacy campaign resulted in numerous federal services and laws for women veterans. These included improvements in health care, counseling, child care, and treatment and compensation for all survivors of military sexual trauma.
I joined shortly after 9/11, and we got the word that we were going to deploy to Afghanistan, and I was the only female with my unit deploying, and then I was sexually assaulted, and at that point, I just became a shell of a person. But I really learned that it is okay to feel how you feel, that it's also okay to ask for help. Go see DAV, they will know how to help you. There are other veterans who can relate to you and will know what you're talking about.
We as veterans deal with things that veterans deal with post-military life, but we also have real life experiences that happen not necessarily in the military, like losing a child. Like divorce, all of these awful things. I was sexually assaulted by a fellow service member, so it gives me a knowledge base and an empathy with other survivors. It makes it a little easier for them to talk to me, knowing what I've been through and knowing that I've come out the other side.
In 2014, DAV produced its groundbreaking report, Women Veterans, The Long Journey Home, and a follow-on report, Women Veterans, The Journey Ahead in 2018. These reports identified key gaps for women veterans in federal programs and services, including barriers to and inequalities in VA healthcare. Both reports have helped to further the conversation surrounding women veterans and led to numerous pieces of legislation and positive policy changes. DAV also advocates heavily for those who care for severely disabled veterans. Every morning, Dave Riley depends on his wife, Yvonne, to attend to his most basic needs. A Coast Guard rescue swimmer and emergency medical technician, Dave contracted a deadly bacterial infection in 1997.
Dave was in a medical coma when they amputated his arms and legs. Without the amputation, he wouldn't have made it.
Well, Yvonne usually gets up a lot earlier than me. She's probably rolling out of bed around 4 to get the coffee to be able to deal with me. Just getting my socks on to get my arms on, that's a fairly long deal if I have to do it myself.
We just learned how to do it, day by day, trial and error.
If she wasn't there, it'd be hours, me getting ready in the morning.
The men and women sign up with the service and their lives change because of an injury. It's not just their lives that change, it's the caregivers and their families' lives that change too.
So people come up to me all the time and say, thank you for your service. And I appreciate that. I appreciate the thanks, but nobody ever comes up to Yvonne and thanks her for the service that she's given to this country in taking care of me. Once she kind of puts me together and feeds me, I'm okay. I can go out and do things, I can drive. DAV has been there from the start on getting the caregiver bill passed, and we're still continuing to try to roll it out for all veterans of all eras.
In 2007, Congress enacted legislation that allowed VA to fund limited programming to support caregivers of veterans.
The Department of Veterans Affairs began a support program for caregivers, providing them with an hourly wage. But only veterans severely disabled after September 11, 2001 were eligible.
We call on Congress to correct this inequity by extending assistance to all seriously disabled veterans of all eras.
DAV worked for equal access to comprehensive VA support services for all caregivers. And in 2018, the centennial year of World War I, the VA Mission Act authorized extending caregiver support to disabled veterans from every period. That same year, thanks largely to DAV's service program initiatives, veterans and their family members received more than $20 billion in earned benefits.
A quote on the American Veterans Disabled for Life Memorial says it best. In war, there are no unwounded soldiers. Over the years, improved government legislation and advances in medical care and rehabilitation have greatly improved the outlook for those wounded or injured in service to our country. But for many of those wounded heroes, the battle never ends. As President Lincoln said, it is a sacred trust to care for those who shall have borne the battle, and for their widow, and for their orphan. And for the past 100 years, the Disabled American Veterans has been there and will continue to be there for them.